Welcome, welcome, welcome to this month's Deal Clinic Live. Can you believe we are in July? It is the beginning of the second half of the year. Are you ready? I hope you are. I trust you are. So as usual, we have another exciting episode. It's actually going to really help both investors and agents along their way in their investing and property sourcing journeys. So as usual, we will have the snippets of this recording going out onto our social media, so Instagram, YouTube, and the full recording will be on our the full recording will be on our YouTube channel in about a week, and snippets will be going out to Facebook and Instagram. Now, you'll be able to find us on our YouTube channel, Sourcing Investments Limited, so feel free to find us there with all previous episodes as well. With all the live viewers watching today that I can see, there's so many of you: Pauline, Pedro, Vasco, William, Dilip. I hope that's everyone so far. I welcome you here with us live, and all of you who watch on the replay too, welcome. If you do have any questions, please do feel free to add those into the chat box. I will be keeping an eye on those along with Tim, and we will divert those questions to the panel today. And that brings me to our special guest. This month, we are looking at how landlords and investors can get into hot water with something known as honey traps. Now, it'll be a great episode for agents as well, because you'll be able to understand how to help your clients minimize and mitigate this potential nightmare. So that brings me to our special guests. Today's special guests are Des Taylor and Phil Turtle of Landlord Licensing and Defence. We also have with us our regular investor, Tim Sanders. Now, I will be sharing the URL to Des and Phil's business if you do need to get in touch with them. So moving on, just to give you a brief insight as to what Des and Phil do, they really help mitigate, limit, or turn around the situations where landlords or unsuspecting investors have gotten caught out by many different factors that are also known as honey traps in the property industry. Des and Phil, over to you.
Good morning. Good morning. So I'm Des Taylor and my colleague is Phil Turtle. The two of us are directors of Landlord Licensing and Defence, and my role in the business is of casework manager. So I deal with managing all the cases that come into the business where landlords have inadvertently or unwittingly got themselves into trouble, either through faults of themselves or faults or failings of their staff or their agents. And it's a very interesting part of the business, and it covers everything from financial penalties for failure to do certain things through to defending in the tribunals for improvement notices, prohibition orders, licensing issues where your license isn't as it should be, or you're having things taken away. And my colleague Phil Turtle, he's our compliance director, and he is responsible for making sure that the landlords that we do the work for are educated and understand what they need to do. And that the properties are compliant with the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, commonly known as Part 1 of the Housing Act, or HHSRS, and fire risk assessments. And anybody who's got any type of commercial business should have a fire risk assessment on an annual basis, whether that's serviced accommodation, HMO, or any type of business, so mixed use, etc. So I'll pass to Phil and just give a little bit of a cover on what that compliance work actually means. Phil, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, well, I have a team of auditors who go out looking at properties across the country, mostly horrors. We find all sorts of dreadful things that are going to get the landlord into a lot of trouble with the council. Councils these days are very, very enforcement centric and financially motivated. They can make an awful lot of money for their own revenue out of fining landlords, and my God, they do. So my team rove the country going to properties to find all the things wrong that the council could find, and then get the landlord suitably organised, get those things fixed before the property gets on the council's radar, and saving them from fines that sometimes can be in the hundreds of thousands. Des?
Thank you. Okay, so there's a little bit about us. Bonnie, over to you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate that. So I believe you both have some honey trap situations where we can just give an overview of how this actually started to occur and how the landlord or investor got into the hot water or the honey trap without realizing. Des, I believe you have a honey trap situation one.
So let me explain what a honey trap is, and let's use some famous people that we know have got caught out in what might be described as honey traps. So let's think of somebody like our ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson gets invited by somebody who he thinks is quite a good friend, and entices him to come along to a certain place to meet some people that might be very well known, or it might even be a secret club or somewhere like that. And at that meeting, he meets somebody who generally, in Boris Johnson's case, is generally a young female who is a paid member of the organisation or team to sweet talk him into doing something or saying something or admitting to something or getting up to something that he might prefer his mother, father, and the rest of his family didn't find out about. And then when he's actually committed that offence, or he said that thing he shouldn't have said, or admitted to that misdemeanour that he shouldn't have done, he's been honey trapped, because now they use it to influence him to do something that he may not want to do, maybe have a party while everybody else is locked up, or all those sorts of things, and then to maybe deny it because they don't want to implicate those other people that might be involved. That would be a typical example of a honey trap. And the reason we call it a honey trap is because it's when somebody moves into something quite unwittingly. They go into it with good intentions. They attend something with good intentions, not realizing that they've actually been enticed into something that they now cannot get out of without significant consequences. And general example of that is when people are encouraged, and I was with an ex-environmental health officer from a council yesterday evening, and he was in agreement that yes, the councils will invite people in to talk about a property or to talk about things. They'll encourage you to talk to them about issues with a property, even though they are not telling you they're going to enforce against you based upon the information they find. So essentially, you wouldn't go into the police station and go, oh, you know, I've got a knife in my hand and some blood and I just killed somebody. Is that a crime? Can I get away with it? Well, that's what the councils are doing. And one of the big things that we've seen is that people buy properties at auction, and they buy them with tenants in situ. And whether that's a buy-to-let or a HMO, they buy that property, sometimes sight unseen, sometimes they've seen it and know it needs some work doing to it. And the day the auction happens and they exchange, they've got generally 28 days to complete. And on that completion day, it's on that day you generally find that either the owner or an agent or somebody working on their behalf will then start to investigate what the property needs to be compliant. Now, if that property, they call the council and say, are we in a licensing area? And they go, well, what's the address? It's 15 Sandwell Drive, Leeds. Leeds City Council go, oh, right, let me write that down. Oh, yes, that's in the selective licensing area. Please tell me a little bit more about that property. Oh, well, we bought it in auction and we bought it yesterday. Oh, great. Well, that needs a license. And they'll write that down, and then they'll see if you apply for a license. Now, if you do it on the same day as you bought it, absolutely no problem, you're compliant. But let's say, like most people, I don't really know what needs to be done. I need to get to the property. I need to look at the property. I need to see what's going on there. And that property's got tenants in situ. What normally happens is you haven't called the council at all. You're the new owner, and the tenants are in this fierce situation where they don't know whether the new landlord's going to evict them, whether he's going to stick the rent up, what he's going to do. And so when the landlord makes contact with the tenant that's in situ, or turns up and says, hello, I'm the new owner, I'd like to talk to you, I'd like to see what's going on. The tenants do things that the landlord has no idea, and that's the tenants get into a panic and they start calling the council or citizens advice or shelter. And at that point, that's when they start doing their inquiries. So a tenant goes to citizen advice or goes to shelter, they'll ask them about the circumstances they're living in. And quite often, what we're seeing a lot of landlords doing is they're buying properties which are converted houses. And those converted houses have some restrictions on them, which might be that they are essentially, as a Section 257 HMO. So it's a converted building. So it will need to comply with management regulations. So the tenant's giving this information to shelter or to the Citizen Advice Bureau or to the council, and they're saying, well, this sounds like something that something strange here. It sounds like you've been living in a situation you shouldn't have been. And what I think you should do is you should talk to the council. So the landlord is just doing what he wants to do. The new owner wanted to buy something, doesn't realise that he'll be advised to talk to the council, the tenants will be advised to talk to the council, and all of a sudden they're in this untenable situation that they've committed an offence they don't even realise they've committed. So just imagine, you see these programs on the TV, and all of a sudden the next morning there's photos with MI5, and this guy's in bad trouble, and all of those sorts of things. Well, it feels the same way for those landlords. Is that I went in to buy something, I bought it in good faith. I thought I was buying a property that I could buy it today, maybe look at it tomorrow, appoint the builders on Wednesday or Thursday, and maybe by middle of next week they can get in. Of course, the tenants are going to want a much better, nicer house. Of course, they're going to move around the house for me to cater for it. And of course, it's all going to be fine and it's all going to be rosy. But what in fact actually happens is literally on the second or third day, the landlord finds out he's bought something and he can't do the things he wants to do. He's a new owner, but he's got tenants who don't want what he wants. The tenants don't go forward in the way that he wants them to. And next thing, he's got enforcement knocking on the door. Now, we see this quite often. If it's not that they're getting a converted building that now has to meet what are known as HMO management regulations from 2007, which are they have to account for safety, they have to make sure they can produce a certificate to the council within 7 days, which sometimes they buy and they can't get that done in the 7 days. It will require the design of the property to be as it should be in the communal areas and in the individual flats, as they're called. And it will mean that the property also needs to be compliant with all the waste management and bits and pieces. Well, these are strict liability offences. So the day the council turns up and takes its photographs, that's all the evidence they need to prove beyond reasonable doubt an offence has been committed. And we have a situation where, the property didn't have the right fire doors, and one of the tenants had put a fridge in the middle of the hallway. He bought it that morning when the council turned up, but he hadn't managed to get anybody to lift it up the stairs. £27,500 fine. 27,500 for not having the right fire doors, and a fridge blocking essentially the fire escape route. There were other things. There was for not having the notice up in this property to say it was a HMO and it had a manager. Initially started out as a £10,000 fine. That's an A4 piece of paper you could write up in 5 minutes and stick on with a pin. But if it's not there, they started at 10,000. Eventually, it's being removed. But these are the sorts of things that landlords are walking into when they buy properties in auction. But the most important thing is when the tenants are in situ, if you're buying them within situ, you are inheriting all the problems that the previous owner didn't deal with. So if they didn't do the prescribed information, the immigration checks, they didn't get the arrears, you might well have a problem that you could collect a load of money from the tenant, but if there's arrears, you have to give it to the previous owner because that might have been in the auction pack that you missed, or it might be one of the conditions of sale. And the second thing is that tenancy right? Has everything been done as it should be? And normally, what most people are doing is the landlord or the new owner is appointing a firm of solicitors who has. They're a firm of solicitors. They deal with landlord and tenant, but they don't deal with all the other things that are underlying that they need to consider. And so they just issue a Section 21 or a Section 8 if they're in arrears, and this tenant goes running to the council, and the landlord or the new owner has completely caught into this situation. And this is more commonplace than you would realise. I would say that probably out of all the cases we see with people buying in auction, 3 out of every 5 comes with a nightmare that had never been thought about at auction. So my advice to investors who are buying at auction, if you don't know about the Housing Act 2004, you don't know about the Housing and Planning Act 2016, and I hate to say there are probably about 15 people I've ever met who do out of the nearly 60 million people in the country there are, it's quite important that you seek advice before you complete on that transaction. And I would say before you even bid on that transaction. We're not auction specialists. We have a partner who is an auction, who does auction specialization and how to buy an auction. But we wouldn't tell you on the auction what to do. But we advise many people on what they should bid, what they should look out for, and what any conditions they might put in with their bidding where they can't see them. But I would never ever today buy any property with tenants in situ sight unseen at auction. That's my advice, because if you haven't had the work done, you haven't had access, you haven't met the tenants, you haven't seen the documentation, it is going to be a nightmare, and you're either going to overpay for the property, or you're going to end up paying the money you overpaid for it, you would have overpaid for it in legal fees and paying people to leave. So it's very complicated.
That's amazing, and thank you so much for that. I have a question with regards to that. I have a couple of questions actually.
Yeah.
The first one would be that you mentioned if they're purchasing a property in auction with a tenant in situ, can these problems still arise if the property wasn't in auction? Can this still be a honey trap?
Absolutely. And people selling with tenants in situ, the reason they're doing it is because they can't get rid of them most of the time, or they're too lazy to do the work to sell it with vacant possession. Yeah, most of the time. Now, there are some people, they sell portfolios and they just have not got the time, the wherewithal to do it. But most solicitors, when advising someone to buy, will say buy it with vacant possession. And we've assisted people in the past where they've had properties and they've said, well, you've got 6 people in there, you say they're on serviced accommodation, or you say they're on short-term lets, but actually they look like they've got tenancy rights. You need to get vacant possession. We're not going to exchange until that's happened, and we actually want them to go. We're not going to actually complete until they're gone, because of that risk. And yes, it can happen. And people do buy. You could sell a property tomorrow with tenants in situ. You might well have just bought it a year ago. You might well have filled it up. It may be absolutely perfect, but why are you selling it with tenants in situ? You've got to ask the question, the same way as people don't take on other people's families and look after other people's children without compensation. They're normally called childminders or babysitters. I wouldn't take on somebody else's. Well, that's the same as you're going to take on somebody else's problems, somebody else's history. It's definitely something you have to consider. And the first place to look is if the tenancy's been done right, the immigration check has been done right, or right to rent, the prescribed information has been delivered properly, the certificates have been delivered properly, you're pretty much on the way to seeing somebody who's doing things correctly. But if there's one thing missing, how many more things are missing? And are those tenants that are actually in the property tenants of the landlord? Because I've seen many cases where a landlord has sold a property to one landlord, sold it to another landlord, and on completion, they've gone straight to the tenants to find out those tenants were actually under a tenancy with a rent-to-rent company that was a mean landlord, or a mezzanine landlord, as some people would read it. There's a middle or intermediate landlord who's actually issued those tenancies that hasn't been revealed until it's too late. This is really quite common. We had a big situation with this down in Southampton, and quite frankly, the buyer, we weren't active with the buyer. We were at the rent-to-rent landlord came to us. Quite frankly, was arrogant and wanted to commit illegal evictions. In the end, we did manage to resolve it all. But yeah, sometimes there's somebody in that the rent-to-rent landlord wanted to sue the new owner and the previous owner for his loss of his contract. In the end, he gave up and said, I'm not wasting my time because the money isn't as much as it's worth to it. But there was that threat there that nobody realised until the completion day. So, these risks are there for everybody. Tenants in situ, dangerous. Know what you're buying into. And if you don't, and you haven't done your due diligence, I think it's very, very silly. And I think any investor would know that. And of course, there are other things underlying. such as the mortgage and the mortgage situations and those things there. I don't see. Did you want to talk about the mortgage?
I was just about to ask you, you must be reading my mind, Des. So I was just about to ask you, from your experience in these situations, like what effect does this have on, having lending or acquiring a mortgage? How does this impact that?
Well, your mortgage lender and your insurer, because they're much the same. When you buy a property, you're not actually, when you're buying interest only, you're not actually buying anything. You're just paying interest on a loan. The property belongs to the mortgagee or the bank or the lender, whichever word you wish to use. And they have an interest in the property. So anything that's happening in that property that they're not aware of puts their security at risk. So if you buy a property and you've got a mortgage on it and they thought you were buying it vacant possession, but it's not vacant possession, it's got tenants in there with liabilities, and you can't do the work that's required under an improvement notice that you might get served by the council. You've got to do refurbishment works that have got to be required under the law. The mortgage company is going to eventually, when the council gets involved, they're going to get an improvement notice served upon them, and they're going to come flying after the landlord or the owner saying, what's going on here? I thought we were buying a house at this value. We've actually got a house that now looks like it's not worth the value. And many of them will say, I'm sorry, there's been misrepresentation. They may call in the loan. There are others that you have situations where they didn't know the people that were living in there were not actually tenants. They were asylum seekers, or they may be used as a bail hostel. They may be tenants that are temporary accommodation. There were all sorts of issues about these that people, the lender doesn't want to have to deal with. And in rent-to-rent situations, which we see more often than not, it's very, very hard to remove the tenancy rights of the occupying tenant if the owner doesn't have a direct relationship with them, because he has no relationship with them unless the intermediate landlord has been removed from the situation through liquidation or death. So it becomes, again, how do we get possession of a property if the mortgage lender wants to repossess it for any reason? And that's what they're looking at all times. Who's in the property? What is the risk we've got? And the insurer, exactly the same. What is the insured risk? And transient people, as I'll call them, the more transient somebody is, the higher the risk to the lender and the higher the risk to the insurance company of damage to the property or the property's value going down. And of course, if you get a road full of residential houses that have been turned into non-residential, or have become social housing for emergency accommodation or move-on care, the value of the area goes down. So again, the ratio of lending against your lending to value ratio, that's also going to change, and that may trigger some issues with the lender as well. So this is very, very common. And we had last year, it wasn't on a recent purchase, it was at a landlord who lived abroad. The house had gone into, not disrepair, some things had happened, and an improvement notice was issued by the local authority. And I've had some landlords aggravate for updates on what's going on about things, but I've never had a mortgage company as aggravatingly every Monday morning an email, what's happening now with the works, what's happening now, what's happening with our security. So yes, mortgage companies are becoming more and more aware of the Housing Act and the requirements of the Housing Act. And it really is, since 2016, with the new legislation that came in, up to that point, they weren't really interested. But what they're also seeing is that the landlords are receiving very large civil penalty fines for non-compliance. And of course, the viability, if you're making, I'd say, £5,000 a year on a property, maybe £10,000 a year, but you get a £10,000 or £20,000 fine. Well, when are you going to make the money? When are you going to get the money from this property? And of course, for every mortgage lender, they want the landlord or the borrower to be profitable in his business. If he's not, I'm sorry, they're going to call in the loan, because we've seen it happen a couple of times now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that, Des. That was very profound and actually very in depth. So I want to quickly move on because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah.
I want to move on to the honey trap situation too, because I believe this is around landlords letting to the council to help homeless for a few days. I believe that's what we're covering in the next potential honey trap.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to cover that. And what's the situation was that the landlord owned a number of properties in the town. The council had some homeless people who needed some temporary accommodation. They approached an agency to see if they knew anybody who could help. What actually happened was the agency decided to say they could help somebody with the agreement they would stay for a week or two, and they allowed them to stay for a week or two, and the person moved in. And for some reason, the agency went through the process of checking these people out, checking their right to rent, etc., and then issued them a temporary license, the same as if they were a social housing tenant. What eventually happened was this tenant wouldn't move on as promised and agreed. And the council were informed when the landlord said, well, we need you to move on, and gave them notice to leave. And they said, look, you've got to go. You've been here a number of months. You haven't paid any money. You need to move on. So what the tenant did was went immediately to the council, to the homelessness prevention department, and said, they're trying to evict me. And what happened was, because the agent hadn't done their job correctly, and because they'd issued them a license, which in a sense was essentially an assured to hold tenancy in a sham agreement, the assured to hold tenancy was formed because it was their only place to live. Because they were previously homeless, now they've moved into somewhere, it becomes their own home. And that's in the Housing Act 1988, Section 1, Part 1, Paragraph 1. So it's right at the beginning. And that's where the AST came in all those years ago. And because that there was no paperwork to say it was an AST, it doesn't change the fact that it is an AST. But they hadn't done the right to rent checks. They hadn't done any of the prescribed information. And here's someone trying to evict them. And of course, now the landlord's been called in by the council from another department, alleged illegal eviction, and is now under a police and criminal evidence interview process, with the chance that they're likely to be taken to the magistrates' court and charged. And that could be quite a large fine for them. But what's more likely to happen is the council doesn't realise that there's rent, that very little rent has been paid. The council like to prove beyond reasonable doubt the offence has been committed, so the tenant can apply for a rent repayment order. And what will happen here is, although the tenant has paid no rent, they'll apply for a rent repayment order, because an order from a judge to repay rent that hasn't been paid will write off the rent that hasn't been paid, so they won't form a debt. And this is a strategy we've worked out now in the case. What happened was, this was a strategy of the tenant to go to certain people, to find people who would take them in, and then to get themselves into a situation where they could live rent free. And this landlord, I'm going to say it because it's true, the landlord last week had a nervous breakdown on the telephone about it. He had a nervous breakdown because he cannot deal with the unfairness of it. He cannot deal with the cost that it's been to him. And he couldn't deal with the fact that the council is likely to take him to the magistrates' court. We are working with the council. We will bring that to a close very, very quickly, because no malice was intended. But they are sticking with that. But what will eventually happen is the tenant will eventually withdraw their allegations, because they've been advised to go to a solicitor, and when we talk to the solicitor, they will withdraw their allegations, and that matter will become closed. But it won't be before the landlord's been through three or 4 months of absolute mental hell and risk of freedom hell in his mind, to deal with this. And these are happening every single day. We've got another case that an AST has been issued to one chap, and it turns out that this chap has going round, he's got a company and he sets up bail hostels.
Right.
And so, I think we've got to look a little bit further than who the applicant is these days, and why they want big houses on their own. I mean, it is very, very much coming. So these are some of the traps that landlords are getting into. And it seems, until somebody has been through it, as we have hundreds and hundreds of times, it seems like you're in a no-win, no get out of situation. You're going to lose completely, and that's what we do. Is we basically try and take the honey away and take away the trap, and that's the best we can do. But it is difficult.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for that. We do have a couple of questions in the chat box, so I'm going to ask you to answer those quickly, because I do want to come over to Tim, and I know that we still have to hear from Phil as well. So Vasco has asked, with regards to the councils, are there certain councils more likely to issue fines to landlords than others? And it's put as an example, Labour-controlled councils, or, you know, is there a specific borough, or is it a specific council?
Right. I'd love to say it's very specific, and I'd love to say yes, it's going to be Labour controlled or Conservative controlled. Got absolutely nothing to do with it. What it's got to do with is whether they have adopted under the Housing and Planning Act 2016 an enforcement policy that includes fining. And if they haven't, then they don't go down that route. So there are some in sort of west of Reading, and before you get to Bristol, there's a few councils there who actually come to us for advice, who don't issue civil penalties. They are very, very much about we're a traditional way of doing it. And if it's serious enough, we'll prosecute. But those that do issue penalties, they will have an enforcement policy, and more of them are coming around to do that. And the reason being is it's self-serving. If you can set it up properly and you can employ the right people and they can go after enough landlords, then as long as you can make enough fines to pay for self-sufficiency, then why not? Anybody would do it. You'd say it's a bit like a sales job. Here, go and sell a load of stuff. We'll pay you we'll pay you a commission on whatever you make. Well, it's exactly the same. And as I predicted in one West Midlands council, I predicted 2 years ago that they would eventually make so much money because of the way they were doing it, that they'd be buying themselves electric cars, new tablets, new iPhones, and they'd all have the latest equipment, body cams and new uniforms. And lo and behold, one of the leading agents in the city came to me about 3 months ago, and he said, you were right. They're buying all the new equipment. They're doing all of this stuff, and they have a no tolerance policy. So, yes, in inner city areas, definitely. Most of London have got civil. They've all got civil penalty policies, and they're the ones that are most clear. The National Residential Landlords Association has done a report on it. Quite surprisingly, some of those are more enforcing than it looks from the outside. But from where we're seeing it, the report that they've got and the answers they've got isn't as accurate as it would appear. And there are some councils aren't mentioned as much as they are actually seen to be enforcing through the tribunals.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Des. Vasco has got a second question. I'm going to ask it, but Vasco, I'll invite you to get in touch with Des and Phil so that you can have some more information that way. But what Vasco has asked, and Des, this will be a direct correspondence between yourselves and Vasco offline, is are you allowed to say which councils this relates to so that other people can avoid that council? Now, if you aren't, is there somewhere where they can look and find where these councils are that heavily fine the landlords?
No, pick your council in your area and look online and just go housing fines Liverpool, housing fines Leeds, housing fines Birmingham. I'm not saying those are the areas, but those are the three cities in a triangle, if you'd like to think of it like that. You can look and see what they do, but it's as much as a small council could be fining as much as a big council. It really does depend. But think of inner city areas. Think of those where there's lots and lots of small houses being turned into HMOs. You're going to find that they're doing a lot of it. And in the deprived areas of cities, so for example, there was a report on rental properties, finding it hard. The agents were finding it hard to rent. And when I looked at the postcodes, and I didn't do anything too complicated, I asked Copilot, which is the Bing artificial intelligence, tell me about these postcodes. Well, it basically told me these were the lower level, roughest areas, biggest crime areas. Well, yeah, you are going to have trouble renting in those areas, aren't you? So, yeah, but definitely you've got to look online. Google's a great research area, but also if you look through, if you go to our website and you sign up to our weekly newsletter, every week we're reporting on the main cases that are coming up, and you'll begin to see a pattern. see a
Fantastic.
pattern
Thank
of who
you.
they are.
Thank you so much for that, Des. I want to come to Tim, who's been very patient and quiet. Tim, I just want to ask you, as our investor, you know, who works really closely with our other investors online, have you ever experienced any of these situations, or do you know investors who have actually experienced something similar?
Yes. Well, firstly, thank you very much, guys. This is really, really useful. It's very, very interesting information. Yes, I have personally experienced this very early on in my investing career. I bought one property at this point, and I'd found two. Sorry, it was a portfolio of 3 flats at auction up in Scotland, and there were tenants in situ. And at this point, I didn't know all the due diligence that I needed to be doing to find out the ins and outs of what I was buying. And it turned out that there was a court tribunal going on against the current landlord for not holding up their the quality of the flats, the quality of where the tenants were living, so that the tenants were coming in situ, and they'd raised cases against the current landlord. So if I was to purchase those, then I'd be inheriting that tribunal case. And I'd already at that point put a small deposit down with the auction company because I thought these were great. I looked at the yields, I looked at the numbers, I looked at everything, and at that point, as far as I knew, they were brilliant. However, later on, when I knew exactly what I should be looking for in more depth, I realized, oh no, these are, I need to stay away from these. So on that one, I took the hit of the small loss of paying the auction fees and walked away from them completely, because I did see some pictures and I saw some issues with I think it was some internal damp works and things like that that needed doing, and the tenants were very, very unhappy. So personally, I've had exactly that experience where I was this close to purchasing something that could have been an absolute nightmare. So actually that comes into a question I've got, which is, are there any differences between England, Wales and Scotland when it comes to the way these fines are dished out from the councils, and how they treat landlords nicely or not so nicely?
Absolutely differences in all 3 jurisdictions. So England has its set of rules, Wales has its own set of rules and has had since 2006. Wales has introduced, similar to Scotland, Rent Smart Wales, which was the need to register as a landlord. Last year they changed many of their laws and systems that are very, very different to England now with regards to landlord and tenant. But when it comes to enforcement, very much the same as the UK, as England, but they do more enforcement through the magistrates' court than they do with civil penalty fines, and especially in the areas that everybody's saying go and invest in. So if you go to Newport and those types of areas where everybody's going, oh, loads of money here, you can buy a house for 35 grand, do it up, sell it for 60. People are doing these things, but on the way they're getting caught out with doing, oh, we'll let some people stay in it temporarily. So that happens in Wales. Scotland, the laws are completely different. They have licensing even for serviced accommodation, and we don't cover the law in Scotland. I will say that now. But Scotland is very different, but very similar. So the same way as we all drive at 70 miles an hour is similar. It's the same sorts of things, but how they go about enforcing is slightly different, and the amounts that they enforce is slightly different. But Scotland also has registration for landlords. It now has registration and licensing for serviced accommodation. And they are very, very much trying to keep residential properties, serviced accommodation properties and HMO properties all in specific areas, rather than the way that we see them across England, where you could have all 3 in one road. So yeah, but no, it is different in each of them, and you should seek advice on those. And if you do need help in Scotland, let me know. We've got some people there who help us. And also in Wales, we don't get a lot of stuff from Wales, mainly because of the changes of the enforcement. The people that we've advised and helped down there over the years are handling that for us. So I don't deal with Wales on a daily basis.
Understood. No, I mean, everything that you've covered so far is very, very interesting. It's very valuable information for a lot of people, and it's something that I think a lot of people, when they come into investing, not necessarily as experienced investors, they think, oh no, it won't happen to me. Like honesty, I mean, I want to make homes for people. I want to do something good for people, but actually the way of the world isn't necessarily like that. And so people get trapped and get caught into it. So I've definitely had the experience, and I know a few people that have had various issues, as you say, with rent to rent, when you've got that extra little clause in there, and people have looked to buy. For me, it mainly seems like there's properties at auction for a reason, and the reason why they're at auction is because there's something that's hidden. I haven't experienced it yet in terms of being on the general market. So for me, so far, it's just been mainly anything that is at auction. I've done extra research on and found there's always something, or very often something.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Tim.
and I think property is very much like cars and taxis and buses. If you want to be a driver of a car, you go and do what you need to do. If you want to become a minicab driver, you've got to do some extra things. So that's like buy to let. If you want to drive a bus, you've got to do some other extra things. That's a bit like running a HMO. If you think about it like that, and if everybody thought it like that, not everybody's going to be a driver.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tim and Des. Really appreciate you for that interaction there. Phil, I want to come over to you because you've been very patient and quiet over there. I believe you have got some information that you can share with regards to potential case study around this with auctions and tenants in situ. But I also want you to be able to maybe explain a strategy on how to minimize this risk from happening. Is that possible?
Absolutely. Okay. Right. I'll try and be quick because I see time's clocking on. A couple of instances. So I'm going to talk about a case study of an HMO bought at auction, but just to say that we've had cases as well where one of our very good clients who's absolutely hot on compliance, a mate of his was getting into a bit of financial trouble, wanted to offload a couple of licensed HMOs. So our client said, yeah, I'll buy them from you. Bought them sight unseen because they're licensed, trustworthy friend. When he got the keys, he started sending me photos of stuff that was not right. And within half a day, he said, Phil, I think you better get in your car and get up here. And he bought 2 HMOs. Across the 2, we found 154 compliance breaches. Had to do an awful lot of work very quickly. Now, let's move to the auction situation. And this is a real case. Came to us middle of last year. It's a fairly large, imposing Victorian mid-terrace in London, and bought at auction, sight unseen, obviously at a good price, which is why the guy bought it. Did he know what he was taking on? I think not. So it had been converted to an HMO possibly 20 years ago. It did have things like fire doors, fire alarms, so that's all good, but they're not to the current regulations, and they're a bit tired and generally didn't work properly. But in the front bedroom, there was a waterfall from the roof coming through. There were 5 buckets on the floor, and you could tell from the walls and the water tracking and the mold. It's been doing this for years, absolutely years. This property had 5 like studio bedrooms, bedsits if you like, little kitchenettes with a baby belling, a sink and a fridge, and so much grime you would never want to touch it. Dreadful situation, mold all over the place. But here's the big thing. I mean, obviously those are things that the council would prosecute for without blinking an eyelid. And also, by the way, damp and mold, guys, is as dangerous as asbestos. Just bear that in mind. It's not just when you see black mold. Black mold, the spores, they fly in the air, they go in your lungs, they build up just like asbestos. But even when it's damp without the black mold, there are bugs, mites, and they also float, billions of them in the air, in your lungs, builds up over years, real problems. That's why that poor kid died last year. It's happening to people all the time, especially in the bedroom, because you're in there for 8 hours a day. Anyway, moving on. So the big problem, I mean, there's all these other health and safety things, but the rooms in this property were not big enough for the current council standards. They've got 5 rooms, 3 of them would not meet the current council standards for size. 2 of those would no longer be allowed to have cooking in them, because the sizes that were allowed way back are not allowed now. One of them was just never ever going to be allowed for letting. So the first thing the council is going to do when they see that is prohibit its use, and you'd have to get the tenant out. The two other rooms that were not big enough, to be used ongoing, they need to have a shared kitchen separate. Now there was a solution. You kick the guy out of the small room, you make that into a shared kitchen, but now you've only got 4 lettable rooms, not 5. And coming back to the mortgage issue, you haven't got the rent cover anymore. So what looked like it was going to be a profitable HMO is now probably not going to be, especially when you look at the amount of investment you're going to have to put into sorting all the non-compliances out. We move on to bathrooms. This is amazing. There's a big bathroom. It had its own electric meter. You could only use the heating and the hot water if you put a little paper card with money on it into the meter to use the bathroom. Absolutely illegal. There's a big studio room, or it seems that way, up in the attic. But of course, the attic's got roofs like this. And from a habitation point of view, any space where the ceiling height is less than 1.5 meters does not count. So you've got this massive looking room because you've got all this space below the 1.5 meter mark. If you measure it properly at the 1.5 meter mark, that one's not habitable. Now, all right, we leaned on the tape measure for that one a bit and got away with it. But, you know, but the other thing is, even though a thing was licensed and at one stage was compliant, time goes on, councils change their standards. They don't tell anybody, but they change their standards. All the rooms had portable electric heaters, no fixed heaters. Again, very dangerous from a fire point of view. The fire alarm, fitted 20 odd years ago, well, it didn't look like it had ever been serviced or tested. Fire doors, massive gaps around them. Guys, if you don't know this already, the gaps around a fire door have to be between 2 millimeters and 4 millimeters. And anything over 4 millimeters, the council can and will prosecute you for. The truth is, I'm actually a fire risk assessor myself. They can be greater than 4 millimeters and the door's still going to work. Everybody's going to be safe. But the council are tick box people and they're out to get us. And if it's 5 millimeters, you're in trouble. What was the other thing? Oh yeah, the chimney was collapsing. That was going to go through the roof sometime soon. And the fire escape route from the back of the house, well, that went through an 8-foot high jungle. There's no way anybody was getting out through that fire escape route. So that's the sort of thing that we see quite often, particularly where places are bought sight unseen. And you've got the added complication that you've got tenants in situ in rooms that are not now considered fit for habitation, don't meet the standards, and you, as the purchaser, let's move now on to the process. 1 second after completion, you are responsible for licensing, because the license just expired at the point of completion, so it's not licensed. You're responsible for all matters to do with compliance with the HMO management regulations. As of now, even though you had nothing to do with it up to that point, it's now your responsibility. You are legally responsible. You're responsible for compliance with the housing. Oh, I can't say this, even though I do it all day. HHSRS, the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. Trips me up every time. And you're responsible for compliance with the council immunity standards. So, if you're buying sight unseen, if you're buying an auction, if at all possible, get a compliance inspection done by somebody like one of my team between exchange and completion. At least then you will know what you've got to fix quickly the minute you get your hands on the keys. If you can't do that, arrange the inspection for the day of completion, because believe me, you are going to be at so much risk until you get the place sorted out. So immediately organise that inspection. You need to organise to get the fire alarms serviced and get a new certificate. get a survey done by the alarm company of what sort of detectors and sounders and alarms are in each room. So you actually have a record of what is there. Get a new gas certificate so you know what you're offering to your tenants is safe. Get a new EICR, get the electricians in, even though it was done maybe 2 years ago. Probably wasn't, probably doesn't exist, probably can't be found. You know, don't scrimp at this point. You're in trouble. Get a new inspection done, get the emergency lights tested and a certificate, get all the electrical equipment in the property PAT tested, and do the tenant's equipment as well. You don't want anything in there that's going to catch fire anytime soon. Then,
sorry, go on. Apologies.
from the survey, if it's ourselves, somebody similar, you will get a schedule of works, not just a report. What needs doing, and it'll be prioritised. So in the first 2 weeks, you spend whatever it takes. You get a team. You bribe trades to come off jobs onto your job, because at the moment, if you notice, we haven't applied for a license yet. Okay, because we don't want to bring this onto the council's radar just yet. So we're taking a bit of a risk. We're not licensing because we don't want them to know this is happening until we've got the trades in and out. So in the first 2 weeks, you're going to get fixed everything to do with the fire alarm system, everything to do with the fire doors, which may need new doors, new frames, all sorts of new hardware, and anything else fire related. Maximum of 2 weeks, get the people in, get it done. And then the second 2 weeks, all the other critical compliance issues, the things that you're really going to get badly fined for. So you've got 4 weeks maximum. And at that point, the license application's got to go in. Now, I noticed there was a question in the Q&A about licenses. I'll just deal with that, if I may, here, because it's relevant. So you don't have to have a license to be legal. You have to have a license application duly made. So we're playing a little game here. We're going about 4 weeks, less if we can, while we get the place compliant, then apply. As soon as you got the application in and all the certificates submitted, you're actually covered. It may be months, sometimes years, before the council actually issues the license. But doing it this way, you get the license application in. Now you're legally safe. The council can come and inspect because you've done all the work. And that's a risk minimization strategy.
Brilliant. And Phil, also, Jeffrey's asked, how much does an inspection cost?
It's about £1,500, depending on the, let's say we're talking about a 5-6 bedroom HMO. It's about £1,500. And it's quite a big piece of work to do.
Okay, amazing. And is that approximate across all councils, or does it depend on the level of work?
It doesn't depend on the council at all. Yeah, we do take into account the council's rules. We'll check the property against that particular council's rules, and we've got about 340 different sets of rules we have to check against. I know, but there's a basic HHSRS covers 29 hazards, and we assess against all of those, and then additionally against the particular council's space standards and those sort of requirements.
Okay, amazing. We've had a question. We've had another question in from Vasca. He says, what about purchase lease options? If you control a property as a holder of a purchase lease option, then you are not the legal owner. So presumably, depending on the contract with the owner, you are liable for any problems. Perhaps this is the solution to get around any honey traps.
Go on, Des.
Des, you're on mute. Yeah, I can see Des nodding.
So I love a bit of music. It keeps me quiet. So absolutely, anybody can be responsible under Section 263 of the Housing Act 2004. Somebody who is in control of a property. So that can be a superior landlord, it can be a freeholder, a leaseholder. It can't generally be the tenant. It will always be a landlord. But if you are a rent-to-renter, which in essence a purchase lease option is you are rent-to-renting while you with the option to buy, you can be responsible. And many councils, I've got many cases at the moment where the rent-to-rent firm is in trouble, and so is the owner in trouble. And although a rent repayment order can only be made against the immediate landlord, improvement notices, enforcement for non-licensing can go up the chain to anybody who's in control and receives as much as the rack rent, which is considered 75% of the market rent. So it's very, very easy to go 2 or 3 landlord levels up if the profitability between them isn't very much. This is why you'll find in leasehold properties the rent is like ground rent's £25 a year, not £10,000 a year.
Okay, thank you for that, Des. Thank you for clearing that up. I hope that helps, Vasca. I'm conscious of time, gentlemen. We have 5 minutes left. But I have a question that has been burning, in the back of my mind. And I just really want to ask this of both of you, because with everything that we've discussed today, I mean, this is such an extensive discussion that we could do another show on this. But just with regards to, the current landlord or the present landlord being liable, even though they were not responsible for creating those issues and want to resolve it, is there any laws or regulations around the actual landlord that allowed that to perpetuate and continue? Is there anything, because they're being very unscrupulous as a landlord with regards to responsibilities and duties. Is there anything in there that even if we take on board or we inherit that responsibility, is there anything there for the previous landlord? Because what we want to do is mitigate them continuing to allow their properties to be rented out in that way.
Yes, the previous landlord will be liable for up to 6 months. The local housing authority has 6 months from the date the offence stops being committed by the person who is the responsible person. And in that 6 months, they must either issue a summons to appear in court or issue a notice of intention to impose a financial penalty. And it must be at a criminal level. So even if the new owner is being harassed and is going to be enforced against, it's going to come out, well, I bought it this way, and of course the council's going to go after the previous owner, and we've seen that happen many times.
Unfortunately, that doesn't help you though as the new owner.
No.
You don't get let off, because the council takes the approach that we'll prosecute and fine everybody we possibly can.
Okay, so it really is important to do the due diligence prior to purchasing the property. And I feel what we've touched on today is that with the short time frame when purchasing an auction, it doesn't really give us as investors or becoming the landlords of those properties that opportunity to do so.
No.
That's where you need an emergency sort of process. If you do that, then the process I outlined is the least risky process.
Okay. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for today's conversation. It has been highly interesting, and I really didn't realize all the nuances around this myself. So thank you for expanding awareness and consciousness around this topic. I have dropped into the chat box for all of our viewers that are here live the URL to get in touch with Des and Phil. So feel free to do that. And then for those that watch on the replay on the YouTube channel, if you can't find or access that information, feel free to email us at admin@sourcinginvestments.co.uk, and we will happily share that information going forward. Phil, Des, thank you once again. Tim, as always, thank you for supporting with the co-hosting and the investors side of questions. And to all of our viewers who are watching live, I want to thank you. So we have B. Elsana, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, Jeff, Jeffrey, James, Jefferson, Liz, Tiffany, Vasca, William, Yasin, and somebody called Zoom user. I do not know your name. I want to thank you for attending live, and all of you that watch on the replay, thank you again also. And with that, that concludes another episode of Deal Clinic Live. See you again next month.